Okay, so I apologize for that delay getting started. I have no idea why this cable is so finicky, but I'm going to see if I can get a replacement for it because it keeps skitzing out. You might have seen that. So today we're going to extend our abilities in Photoshop a bit, and the slides that I'm going to show you aren't particularly long, but we'll spend a lot more time actually doing demonstrations because talking about this concept is harder than actually just seeing it work. And so what we'll talk about today is something called blending modes in Photoshop. And I would argue that blending modes are kind of one of the more powerful things that are built into Photoshop. And it's certainly something that you'll use in your design career going forward if you really understand how they work. Essentially, if we can use the analog example of what's happening here, it would be as if we had an original drawing and we started to layer up trace paper over that original drawing. In its simplest term, the opacity slider basically allows more or less of what's the tracing paper that's on top to be seen. So if we drop that opacity slider down, we see less and less of it, and eventually it's transparent. We just see the original drawing itself. In the case of a blending mode, however, it's kind of like changing from using white trace to using yellow trace, or changing from using white or yellow trace and using clear film. It's a different way of applying opacity, or the layer that's on top, toward the layer that's on the bottom. So let's use some examples to try to show how this works. First off, we'll go through what the blending modes are and typically what happens in the various blending modes. They're divided into groups. The groups are shown over here to the right. Typically, we live in this normal set up here, and generally it says normal. Then we have these other blending modes. This set darkens. Then we have a set that lightens, and we have a set that both darkens and lightens and doesn't change the middle. And then at the bottom, we have a few kind of specialty ones. We will work today primarily with multiply, which is right there. And actually, I think the next slide shows those, so we don't have to. There we go. Yes, there's a lot of options, but we're going to work today with multiply. We're going to work with screen. And then we're going to work with overlay. Later on the semester, we'll work with soft light a little bit more. I'm sorry for this flickering. It's going to drive me nuts all day. And we'll also work with luminosity, which is at the very bottom. Yeah. So let's go through a few illustrations of blending modes. So in all the slides that I'm going to show you, essentially, we have two layers. And you guys are going to have a sample Photoshop file that we're going to download. The topmost layer is right here in the front. It has a black square, a 50% gray square, and a white square. And then it has a gradient that goes across the bottom. Below that is just a basic blue. And it doesn't matter that it's blue. It could be red. It could be any color. The point is I want to distinguish what these two layers are in Photoshop. The blending modes that we're applying are going to be applied to that top layer, so the layer that has these squares on it. And we're going to see what happens as we go forward. So I'm going to illustrate what each of these are. Then we'll switch over to the school computers. You guys will download the sample file, and we'll go through it all together. So if it doesn't quite make sense in the live lecture demonstration, don't worry, it will soon. So here's our base drawing. This is what it looks like if the topmost layer, which is the squares and the gradient, are completely opaque. We see them on top of the blue background, and this is what we get. If, however, we take that topmost layer and we apply a multiply blending mode, and if you remember back to that slide, multiply was in the darken section, so it's going to have an effect of darkening the image. So what happens in this blending mode is it says, what is the base value of the blue? If we were looking at that in terms of a gray value, it's a I don't know, a 55% gray, maybe something like that. If the image that's on top, if the layer that's on top is darker in a spot, we want it to get darker. If the image is neutral, we want it to get a little darker. And if the image is lighter than what's on the bottom, we want it to just disappear altogether. So when we apply this blending mode, the white is going to become completely transparent because it's lighter than the background. The dark is going to become even darker. It's going to make the background darker. And the middle is going to slightly darken. Okay, so that's with a multiply. So the general effect of a multiply is it's going to darken the image. let's take a look at the screen. So this was in the light section, or the lighten section. And essentially what's going to happen here is the opposite of what just happened. So things that are darker, in this case the black, is going to become transparent. Things that are in the middle are going to become slightly lighter. And things that are lighter are going to become a lot lighter. So let's look at it once that screen mode is applied. And lo and behold, the black goes away. My black wasn't quite pure black, so we see a little artifacting there. But essentially, the darker is going transparent. The medium is lightening up the background image slightly. And the white is completely lightening up that image. Overlay essentially does both. It darkens the darks and lightens the lights and keeps the middle transparent. So you see how I'm kind of putting these together. Multiply darkens, screen lightens, overlay, middle, we're going to darken and lighten. So let's look at it in context. The darks are going to get darker, the lights are going to get lighter, the gray is going to become transparent. So there we are. We're getting darker in the darks, lighter in the lights, and the gray medium value is becoming transparent. So these are, in effect, what blending modes are. And I'm going to start to show you how they can be used as we go forward. OK, so I'm going to switch over to the other computer. Bear with me for just a second, because I have to unplug and replug, given the jumping around of the projector screen. And then we'll get there. If all of you, while I'm switching over, would bring up exercise 105 on the course website and download under part 1, there's a sample Photoshop blending modes PSD file. I want you to download that and open that up in Photoshop, because we're going to need that. OK, so I apologize for that delay in switching over, but I think we're up and working. And this HDMI cable appears to work fine, so I don't think it's going to skits out on me. So what I had you all do, hopefully you've already done this, go to today's exercise, fall of 2017. This is exercise 105. And right here, there's a Photoshop blending modes.psd file. I want you to download that file. And then we'll go ahead and open it up. And essentially, the file that's going to open is exactly like the one I showed in lecture. And we're going to do this together in a live example so that you can see kind of how it works. And so what I have here in my Photoshop file is I have my background layer, which is the blue color that we've seen before, on top of that. And remember, the layers work like a stack of paper. So if the blue background, that's my lowest layer, that's the one that's on the desk first. The next layer that goes on top of it is this layer 1, which has the black, gray, and white squares and the gradient from black to white. If I were to turn the background off, you could see it's transparent in those bars so that we can see what the blue background looks like. We'll continue on with layer 2 and layer 3 in just a second, but essentially what layer 2 and layer 3 are two versions of a little drawing. And we'll show you how those kind of play into a design sense for what we can do with those in a little bit. But first, let's look through and identify how these various blending modes come to pass. So if I select layer 1 as my layer, remember the blending mode is always going to be applied on the top layer. So we're not going to do, if I put a blending mode on this blue layer, it's not going to do anything. So I'm applying it to layer 1 at this point. And the blending modes can be accessed right here from this little drop-down menu. It says normal by default. If I click on normal, we see that list that I showed you a little bit earlier in lecture. Normal and dissolve are our two, quote, normal blending modes. Then we move into the generally darkening the image blending modes. Then we move into the generally lightening. We move down into the both darken and lightening. And then we have kind of the extras that are at the bottom. So the first thing that I want you to do is I want you to select multiply from this menu. And when we do that, you can see that the dark here, the black, darkens the blue so that it's a much darker shade. The medium does a little bit of darkening to the blue. And the white becomes completely transparent, which is the whole point. If I were to switch the multiply blending mode down to screen, the darken, and like I said, I apologize, it's not quite black. You can probably see on the screen it's a dark gray, not a black. My mistake. It becomes transparent or very transparent. Then we move into the medium value. It becomes a little bit lighter blue. And then the white becomes almost pure white at that point. As we move down even further, we're going to do the overlay blending mode, and you're going to see that the middle value becomes transparent, and the dark becomes darker, and the light becomes lighter. Okay, so this is exactly what I was talking about, but it shows you where you apply those various settings over here. So if you can kind of see where this is going, I'm going to turn off layer 1 for right now. I'm going to turn on layer 2, which gives me a black and white drawing. Okay, and so this kind of a black and white drawing is your classic output from SketchUp. Okay, we've got black lines on a white background. I don't know whether you've tried this before, but sometimes you want to do a little bit of collage work. In Photoshop, you did some SketchUp modeling or whatever, and you can go in and you can erase the white. Right? You could do a color select and you could get rid of the white so that the black would show up on top of your drawing. That's a big hassle. Instead, we can use this blending mode to make the white become completely transparent. So that's going to be in the darken section here, and we're going to use the multiply blending mode. And when that happens, the white goes away, and the black essentially stays there and darkens up the image. Now, I could have any color in the background. I happen to pick blue for this, but it could be anything. It could even be just the colored rendering or something, and we could have the lines show up on top of it. If I switch from multiply to screen, however, right, we get the white drawing, but we get lines that are blue showing through. So it's the opposite effect. The white stays opaque, and the little bit of blue becomes transparent, and we get the background shining through. If I switch into the overlay mode, it's going to be kind of a hybrid of both and not really get me much. So in this context, the one that I'm really looking for is the multiply blending mode, because it makes those drawings shine through. The opposite works OK if you wanted kind of a blue line drawing look. Let me turn off layer 2 for a second, and I'm going to turn on layer 3. So this layer 3 is essentially the opposite of the drawing that I just showed you. The drawing that I just showed you had a white background with black lines. This one has a black background with white lines. So in this context, if I switch blending modes right here into darken, I'm not going to get too much out of it. I'm going to get a little bit of blue shining through where the lines were white before. However, if I switch down here into screen, I'm going to get the old school blue line drawing, where I have a blue background and I have nice bright white lines on top of that blue drawing. If I switch into the overlay mode, it's kind of a combination of both and doesn't do too much. So in this context, if I had the black background, doing the screen mode gives me the best result. If I had the white background here, doing a multiply gives me the best result. And so depending on what you're trying to do, one or the other of those might be the ideal setup. OK, so that's enough of the sample file. Now we're going to go through and say, what can we do when it comes to actual photography with blending modes? And I'm going to show you kind of how this works with photographs. We will concentrate on blending modes today for the rest of the day in kind of using it in a photographic sense, enhancing old images and that sort of thing. However, the techniques that I just showed you about using the blending mode will apply later on in the semester. So you really want to become familiar with blending modes, and that's the point of spending a whole day talking about just blending modes. Right? It would be easy for me to just add this in as a small module onto something else, but the truth is that blending modes is something you really need to understand and see, because we're going to use them a lot more as we go forward. So what I'm going to do is I move on into part 2. By the way, you don't have to save anything from that first part. None of that's relevant for what we're doing for our exercise. It's just practice so that I can illustrate what's happening as part of this lecture. So when we move into part 2, I'm going to work with the multiply blending mode. And in this context, the best kind of image for me to use is something that's kind of an old faded image, because I'm going to try to enhance that old faded image. So I'm not suspecting that you took a photo that's old and faded. We're going to go find one. And I'm going to do that by going to the Creative Commons search. So I'll do search.creativecommons.org. And I like this search, particularly when we're doing stuff in the class where we're trying to adapt other people's work, because it's not violating any license agreements. So theoretically, if I'm a photographer and I go out and I photograph something, I hold the copyright to that image. I own that image. And if I don't authorize somebody else to use that image, I can come after them and say, no, you need to pay me to use the image. And so by choosing an image that's through the Creative Commons, you gotta love it when they change stuff, right? There it is. By using the Creative Commons, these are images that people who took them said, yeah, it's OK to adapt and use my image. I'd like it if you'd credit me for using the image. It's actually, most of the time, it's required that you credit somebody for using the image. But you're free to use it and modify and adapt it. And that's important. If instead I went to Google Images and I were looking up something here, it's not necessarily something that I'm allowed to work with. Somebody might own the copyright and might come and say, well, I want some money, or I want something for it, or please don't use my image. In the 10 years that I've been teaching, I've only had one person have an issue with, I had a student use an image that was a copywritten image, and the person actually contacted me and said, please tell your student to not use my image and take the image down. So it does actually happen. But that only happened once in 10 years. So it's not that big a deal. But when you get in the habit of doing this, it's nice to work that way. So I'm going to use this search.creativecommons.org to make my search. I'm going to search using Flickr, which is right here. So I'm going to make sure that I click on Flickr. And I'm going to come up here into my search query, and I'm going to say old photograph. And I'll see what comes up. So ideally, I'm looking for an old photograph that's kind of washed out or faded in some way. And so you can scroll down here. A photo like this old farm photo, that's a pretty good photo to begin with. So I'm not going to get much out of it. So I want something that's kind of old and faded and is missing pieces and that sort of thing. So I can show you some enhancement here. All right, let's take a look at this one. And again, you can pick any one that you want. I'm going to go ahead and download the image. And when I'm searching in Flickr, if I want to download the image, there's a little arrow with a line underneath it over in the right. If I click on that, it's going to show me all the sizes that are available. I want the original size, which really isn't that big, but it'll work for what I'm doing today. And I'm going to download that. Once it's downloaded, I'll show it in my folder here. There it is. And I'm going to right-click and say Open with Photoshop. And there it is. So you're free to pick any image that you want for this part of it. And essentially what I'm going to do, by the way, what we're posting relating to this is the original plus the modified. So we're doing 2 for this particular section in part 2. And so what I'll do is I'm going to play with the multiply filter in this. Now, in order to apply the multiply filter, I need a layer on top of another layer. So if we look over here at our layer stack, I only have a background layer right now. So it's only listed as background. I need another copy of this layer. So I'm going to right-click where it says background, and I'm going to say duplicate layer, which gives me a second copy of my background. So I have background copy on top of background. I'm going to take the background copy, and I'm going to switch from normal to multiply. And so you can see when I do that, that it immediately darkens up what was really faded and gives us a lot more contrast in our particular image. Now, in some cases, that may be a bit far. I may have pushed it a little bit too far, in which case I can come to the opacity slider next to multiply, and I can drop that opacity down just a little bit. So obviously, if I dropped it all the way to 0, it would be back to the original image. But some combination at about 60% in my image, that looks about right, maybe 70%, to get the right amount of contrast. If you've done this and it doesn't feel like quite enough, you can duplicate the layer again and apply a multiply on top of the multiply. So you can stack the multiplies if you needed something a little bit more. Let's see if I can find an image that's even darker or even lighter to show you that example. Let me do this one.
So when I downloaded the photo, I put a whole file in there, not just a photo.
Like a web file in HTML?
No, it's just like a bunch of different
I'll have to come take a look. So let me show this one in the folder. There it is. Let me right click and say open with Photoshop, and I'm going to do this one again. There, this one. I'll do the same thing. Right click on background, duplicate layer, and then I'll switch this one into multiply. And there we go. We get a lot more out of that. So same process on those two. Now, as we move forward, I did that in two different examples. As we move forward, first thing I need to do is I need to save the original. So here's the original. Let me go to File, Save As, or excuse me, Save for Web. If your images are larger than 1,000, cut the size down to 1,000. Remember, we're posting a bunch of images today. So I'll save it as 1,000. I actually would rather have mine as a JPEG. So let's go JPEG high. Perfect. Let me click Save. And we need to go into today's folder. There we go. So I'm going to call this multiply original. I'll click Save. And then I'm going to turn on the multiply, and I'll go File, Save for Web. Same process here, 1,000. Save. And instead of multiply original, this will be multiply modified. What you name it is up to you. And I'll click Save. OK, so now I have the original plus the modified version. I'm going to move on to another image. I can use the same image, but a lot of times it's more enjoyable to pick different images as you go through. And I'm going to try screen and see. Remember, screen is all about lightening the dark parts of the image. So if I apply a screen to this instead of a multiply, go into screen, it should lighten up and give me more detail that are in the background. And in this case, it didn't help too much with that image. Let me see if I can find another image that I like a little bit better. A large part of this work is actually going and finding the image that works. OK, so let me take this one, and we'll try that one out. Let me download the original size here. Show in folder. I'm going to right click and say Open with Photoshop. All right, there it is. So let me duplicate the background again. So I'll right click and say Layer from Background. There it is. And this time I'm going to try to enhance some of this, lighten up some of this darker section. So, oops, sorry, duplicate layer. OK, and then I'll take this one, and I'm going to turn it to screen. There we go. So we get a little bit more detail in the shadows, just a little bit, like that. So it really didn't help too much with the image, but I want you to go through the process of doing it anyway. So I need to save these, same thing, File, Save for Web, 1,000. Only this one's going to be screen. So when I'm on the Flickr site here, if I click on the little arrow with the line underneath it, it'll bring up all the sizes that are available for download. And I'm picking the largest size that I can find. OK, so I will have saved both of those versions. The next thing is to experiment with the overlay mode. And so this is lightening the lights and darkening the darks. So let's go back to that first image here and play with an overlay on this one, because I think it'll work fairly well. So instead of applying a multiply, let me turn that one off altogether. I'm going to duplicate this layer one more time. And actually, let's call this overlay for clarity there. And instead of using the multiply, and instead of using the screen, I'm going to come down to the overlay mode, which darkens the darks and lightens the lights, which is kind of that mid-range. So in that case, it did pretty well. It maybe is blowing out the bricks a little bit too much in this particular image. I could choose to duplicate that one more time and stack the two together, which gives me more in the background, but it might be a little too black in the front of the gates. So you have to find what the right amount is. Yeah, probably about like that is not too bad. I'm going to save that as my overlay version. So we're going to try a multiply, we're going to try a screen, and we're going to try an overlay. That's part 2, part 3, and part 4, saving original and modified each time. Okay? So that gets us to 6 images. We're going to move on into part 5, where we're going to pick an image with a lot of red tone in it. Okay? Or an image with a lot of blue tone in it. And I'm going to show you what you can do with a different blending mode. So let me go ahead and open up an image. And this could be something that you picked as your images here. So it could be one that you shot the other day. Let me see if I can find a good one here. Okay, I'll take this one, sunset, for example. And so what I'm going to do in this one is I'm going to use a luminosity adjustment on a curves adjustment layer. So first thing I'm going to do is do a curves adjustment. So we did this last class. I'll go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to go to Curves. There's my curves adjustment, like we did last time. I'm going to do a traditional S curve. So I'll pin the point in the center, and then I'm going to pull this curve up a bit and this curve down just a bit, like that. We can see the change that happened there. So it made a little bit of an enhancement already, the curves adjustment. Now I'm going to apply a luminosity blending mode on top of the curves. So I'll change from normal all the way down to the very bottom is luminosity. And when you look at a luminosity adjustment, it makes it so that this isn't quite so oversaturated in color. So let me change it back to normal, and we'll see if I can show you on the screen a little bit. If we're looking on the screen here, we're starting to lose some of the reds. They're becoming oversaturated. It's easier to see on your actual computer screen than it is on the projector here. But we're starting to lose some of the detail in those colors. When we switch to luminosity, this blending mode is working with the colors themselves. And instead of getting that overexposed too much saturation in the sunset, it drops down some of that saturation so it's not quite as strong. I'll do that on another example image here in a second. Let me go to Open. Let me use the one with the food from last class. This one has a lot of red in it. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'll go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and this time I'm going to go to Curves. Say OK. There's my curve. I'll peg a point right here in the center. We'll bring this up a little bit. We'll bring that down a little bit so we get our traditional S curve. There it is. There it is before. There it is after. We can see that we're getting a little bit too much oversaturation in the reds right in there. So instead of leaving this just as a curve, I'm going to come up to my blending mode and go down to luminosity. And now I'm getting a good enhancement of the darks and of the reds, but I'm not getting that oversaturation in the reds that I was. So it's just a slightly different way of enhancing the image. It's subtle, but it can really improve images with lots of blues and lots of reds. So sunsets, food image like this, those are good examples of where to use this luminosity adjustment layer. We're going to flip over and work on part 6. One of the things that happens when we're working in photos, Photoshop, etc., is sometimes images are just too clean. They look too perfect, and we need a little bit of dust or grime or dirt. And it's not so critical for just a photograph, but if we're applying this to a collage that we're working on. So for my industrial design students, this is a good one for you guys. When you're doing your speaker design, right, and you're collaging in some of the textures on your speaker, speakers are never perfect. They get beat up, they get dirty, they get little bits of filth on them, scratches and whatever. And so maybe it's your goal to show it in its perfect rendered state, but maybe you want to show it as if it's really being used. And in that context, using something like a grunge texture, add just a little bit of grit, is really critical to the overall process. Same thing happens in the world of architecture. If we were designing a building and we showed the perfect rendering where everything's perfectly clean, that's one thing. The more realistic approach is to actually have some dirt and some grunge to it. OK, so you guys have seen Pixar movies, right? You guys have seen like Toy Story and that kind of thing. I'm assuming you've seen at least one Pixar movie. Do you know that there is a team of people in the Pixar development process whose responsibility it is to make things dirty? That's their job in rendering, is to make things dirty. Because otherwise, those movies would look too clean. They look too perfect, right? Real life is dirty. It just is. So we need to do that as part of this process. So I'm going to show you right now how you can bring some of that dirtiness or that grunginess to a particular image. The examples that I'll show you are probably over the top, but you can get the idea of where the subtle balance might lie. So let me go ahead and open up an image. And you guys can pick whatever image you want for this. I'll open up another image. Let's see here. I'll open up this one. OK, so here's another example image here. And I'm going to add some texture to this particular image. So first thing I'll do is I'll go on my Creative Commons search. Let me back up here. Oops. Search.creativecommons.org. And I'm going to look for Grunge Texture. Now, the truth is, I have a file on my flash drive that I save Grunge Texture. So when I find one that I like, I keep it. But essentially, what we're looking for is we're looking for a texture that is a little bit dirty. So I'll use this paper one, for example, because it'll show really well in what I'm doing. But sometimes you want one that's a little bit more subtle. And so maybe something just like this would be good. This one might be a little bit strong. But as you go through, you can see lots and lots of examples. And you can pick them. And you end up kind of saving them so that you can use them later on. If you start to do serious Google searching, you can get into Grunge Texture packs, where you can download big packages of these kinds of textures and use them a little bit later on. So I have two examples here. I have this paper, and I have this much more subtle little bit of dirt. I'm going to download them both. So we'll take the paper one first. I want the largest file I can get, so we'll take the original size. There it is. Let me show it in the folder. This time, when it's done downloading, I'm actually going to copy it to my flash drive. So let me go ahead and go to Copy, and I'll put it into today's folder. That was not what I wanted. Today is 105. And let me drop it in here. And let me download the second one. Perfect. There is that second one right there. Let me copy that. And again, I'll put it into my folder for today. There it is. OK, so let me go back to Photoshop. Here was my original image. I'm going to take that grunge texture and place it right on top of this image in the layer stack. So I'll go up to the File menu here, and I'll go to Place. And I'll go find that piece of paper, and I'll click Place. And it drops in on top of my image. Now, in this size, it's much smaller than what I need. So I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. If I just drag it and make it bigger, I can squish the proportions of the image. If I hold down the Shift key while I drag, it's always going to stay in proportion. Now, for this texture, does it really matter that it stays in proportion? Probably not. But it's up to you. Let's make that a little bit bigger, something like that. So now it's completely covering up my image. We'll go about like that. I'm thinking rules of composition, that is falling right at about the third line. You guys always keep that in the back of your mind. I have that grunge texture here, and I'm going to change the blending mode that's applied to it. So I'll come over here, and I'm going to change the blending mode, and we'll try screen first. OK, so in this context, you can still see a bit of my image there in the background, but this was predominantly light in its color. So I'm not seeing enough of my image. So I'm going to change from screen. I'm going to try multiply and take a look there. So in this context, we're really seeing that little wrinkle that's going through the top of the page, almost as if this was printed on the page, but it might be a little bit too much. So let's try overlay. OK, so that's not a bad compromise between the two. This still may be a little bit strong, and I told you I would probably over-exaggerate this while I was doing it in a lecture, in which case changing the opacity here might be of value. So let me drop that opacity down. And there's some value where this starts to feel a little bit more like it's printed on a page or on an old piece of paper rather than the image itself. I could take this image and I can make it look even more antiquated by applying an adjustment layer. Oh, let me commit to the size here. Let me go into Layer, New Adjustment Layer. Again, this is not something you have to do. I'm just showing you because sometimes I get excited and I want to show you things. So let me go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. We're going to do a channel mixer. And I'm going to convert this into monochrome. And I'll figure out what the right filter is. So this is what we did last class, something like that. And now this is starting to become almost a black and white drawing. So you can see how this can snowball on itself, depending on what it is that you want to do. Let's apply something to one of these other images that's not quite so strong. So I'll use this image this time. Let me go to File and then Place. And I'll use this image this time. There it is. Let me make it a little bit bigger. I'll hold down Shift, make it a little bit bigger. Make it a little bit bigger there. And I think this one's almost all lighter than my original image. So my guess is that multiply is going to be our best bet here. Yeah, multiply. That's pretty good. And we can see there's just a little bit of dirt that's starting to apply as part of this. So this might not be something that's relevant for your assignment that's due next class. Remember, it's due before the start of next class. But it's something that when we start to work on collaging, it can be really important. You're trying to put your building into an existing photograph. If your building is perfectly clean in its rendering, or the textures are perfectly clean, but the surroundings are dirty, right? Let's say you're building something in Africa, where it's the context and the city and everything is dirty. If you put this brand new, perfectly white, clean box there, it's not going to feel right. So you make sure that you collage in this little bit of dirt, and it makes a big difference in your overall rendering. Okay? So you're going to do that. I'd like you to, again, do 2 images total, the original and the one with the grunge. So once you're all said and done, and you've made it through all 6 steps, you're going to have a total of 10 images, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 images. You're going to post those in gallery format, just like you did last class as a slideshow. Same concept. Make sense? So the important thing here is to really play around with blending modes, feel comfortable. If you want to try out some of the other blending modes, I've concentrated today on multiply, screen, overlay, and luminosity. If you want to try some of the other ones, by all means, try it. So we could try the difference one, for example. Well, that wasn't exactly what I wanted to have happen. Let's try the exclusion and see what happens. Okay? Very different. So my point is, feel free to play around with this stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. Right? We could come down here to saturation and see what that does. Yeah, that's not exactly what I wanted. Maybe vivid light. Oh, definitely too much. But you get the idea. Okay? So play around with these various options, and you may find that one looks better than the other. Okay? Are there any questions about blending modes? Not yet. Okay. Give it a shot.